So in 2013, I had an opportunity to go back to Eastern Europe and track down the people I had interviewed basically 20 years earlier. And I had been in Eastern Europe in 1990 and talking to them about, their experiences coming out of communism. And I was given an opportunity to return, track those people down, interview them, and ask them what had changed in their lives and in the lives of their countries. And the most dramatic thing I learned was how rapidly liberalism had risen and fallen. It had been the kind of preferred replacement to communism after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the communist regimes after 1989. It enjoyed mainstream acceptance. It became basically the orthodoxy of the region for a couple of years. And then it began an inexorable and ultimately rapid decline. And by 2013 or so, when I was back in the region, it was very difficult to find any liberal parties in power. The right had basically taken over in Hungary, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, parts of former Yugoslavia. And even more troubling, there were even further extremist groups on the right that were kind of waiting in the wings to take over if these kind of simple right-wing parties failed. And it got me thinking about the kind of siege that liberalism was under, not only in the region, but throughout Europe and throughout the world, really. And when Donald Trump won in 2016 here in the United States, when Brexit was successful in the UK, I realized that many of the things that I'd seen in Eastern Europe, that trajectory of the rise and fall of liberalism, was being reproduced elsewhere around the world. As I began pushing at that topic, I came up against certain, what I considered misconceptions about the far right around the world. One was that this was a temporary phenomenon, and that the political temperature would rise and fall, that the right would win, say, in 2016 with Trump, or in Brazil with Bolsonaro, or in Japan with Shinzo Abe. But that's the natural course of politics. The left would naturally be the beneficiary of a backlash and come to power in subsequent elections. But I pushed against this idea because I argued that the far right, as we see with Trump or Bolsonaro or Modi or Abe, is not interested in normal politics, and not interested in accepting the results of a fluctuation in political temperature. What they're interested in is basically restructuring politics so that they or their successors are in power forever, or for as long as they can maintain power. In other words, they look to leaders like Vladimir Putin, who is basically a right-wing nationalist figure, who's been in power one way or another since 1999, or to Erdogan in Turkey, who I would consider to be, say, a center-right rather than a far-right leader, but a nationalist nonetheless, but who has also been in power basically since 2002. In other words, these are leaders who have successfully restructured their political environments to ensure that they maintain power, but not just they as individuals, but their party maintains power and creates a kind of patronage system that is very powerful and extremely difficult to dislodge. So I wanted to, number one, show that this was a very good possibility, not just in authoritarian countries where we expect leaders to kind of rule forever, like Sisi in Egypt, for instance, but in democratic countries where we expect the democratic guardrails, so to speak, to contain the ambitions of an authoritarian personality. But and I was in a series of articles and ultimately this report arguing that quite the contrary, the democratic guardrails are being deconstructed by these authoritarian personalities. The second misconception I wanted to argue against was that these are phenomena that take place within the boundaries of given states. That these are nationalists, and the nationalists are interested in preserving sovereignty, strengthening borders. They're not going to have anything to do with one another. I mean, the notion of a nationalist international is a contradiction in terms. How could you possibly bring these people together to agree on anything? And in the research that I conducted, in the interviews that I conducted, I discovered quite a different picture, that not only are the leaders and their parties cooperating to an unprecedented extent across borders, but we've seen two other kind of phenomena. One would be the cooperation of right-wing and in many cases extreme right-wing civil society organizations working across boundaries, but also the digital sphere in which ideas, of course, go across borders without any restrictions often. And that new narratives and stories have emerged from the far right that have become quite persuasive to people, even though they might have emerged in one language in one country, they've been translated into other languages and other cultural contexts and proven quite powerful across borders. So those would be the two kind of misconceptions that I was pushing against in the research I was doing.